Right there. Hooked up. Fish on. What is going on, guys? Today we are back with another video here. And today, whoa, this fish is going crazy under the boat. What the heck is going on here? Today's video is going to be a little bit different. Today we're going to be talking about my 3 absolute favorite walleye rods to use really all season long. I can't fish walleyes where I'm at right now. That will change soon as I'll be going on a road trip, but we'll probably catch a few smallmouth bass like this. Holy cow, is that just a little porker right there? But one question we get asked a million times is using what rods do I use for walleyes, and basically a whole bunch of different application type stuff. And most of us this year, just like me, find ourselves on our phones or on the computer buying up just a ton of fishing tackle, all the new stuff for every year. And it's kind of the exciting part about starting a new season like this. And if you guys are in the market for some walleye rods, I'm going to discuss my absolute top 3 that are used for a wide variety of applications. Kind of my core 3 rods that, as long as a spinning rods are coming with, otherwise it's not a trolling thing. These are the 3 rods that come with every time that can pretty much cover the spectrum for everything you're going to want to do for walleye fishing, or really smallmouth fishing too. And don't think because I'm just talking about a more high-end rod that you guys have to get this exact one and spend X amount of money or spend this amount of money. But when I talk about models of rods and certain actions for certain applications, look for rods that kind of have these same characteristics, kind of no matter what price point you're looking at. So with that being said, let's kind of go into my favorite 3 walleye rods. All right, walleye rod number 1. We'll start with this one because I just caught a fish on it. This is a 7/6 medium light. This is obviously the Elliott Rods. That's pretty much what all my rods I use are, these Elliott Rods. Phenomenal rods. Paul and Greg make some absolutely insane stuff, and they've killed these things. They're ultra light, ultra sensitive. But action-wise, what are we talking about here? This is the 7/6 medium light. Like I said, when do I use this? What do I use it for? Well, today I'm using it for a hair jig. It's a great rod to use for casting very, very light things. Most of the time for walleye fishing, I will either use this as a hair jig rod for very light stuff like this, like I said. Otherwise, most of the time it's my live bait rigging rod and my slip bobber rod. And it is absolutely phenomenal like that. And we'll try to find some archive footage here to show you some hook sets. But basically, why you want a long, medium light action rod like this is to really load that thing up, right? And this rod does a great job of that. It's very sensitive, very light. It's 7.5 feet long. It really loads up a lot on this tip, and I'll try to show you guys kind of the best I can. So there's a lot of tip load, and it loads fairly far down into the rod, right? And that is exactly what you want when you're doing something like Lindy rigging, for example. Most of the time you're kind of putting around or drifting with the trolling motor, line on the reel just like that. That fish bites and you just kind of let them run, right? And when you're Lindy rigging, you want this very long swinging hook set a lot of times, because you got to pick up all the slack line that fish ran out. And a lot of times what might happen is halfway through your swing, this rod might not even be loaded yet. You still might be catching up to that fish. But that's kind of the point of the softer action, very long rod. Long rod, you get a very long sweeping hook set out of it, number 1. Number 2, you can load the tip of this rod up while that fish is eating, so they're not detecting it. Too stiff of a rod when you're doing something like rigging or something like that, or slip bobbering, what's going to happen is the second you get tight line, that fish is going to feel a lot of pressure on him, right? And he might drop it. Where these longer, lighter action rods that are very sensitive like this, you can kind of load that tip up, and a lot of times what will happen is you'll kind of be doing a little bit of reeling to catch up on those fish. That tip will start to load, and then you do that long swing, right? So having a longer, slightly lighter action rod than like a lot of our jigging rods or power ripping rods, stuff like that, absolutely crucial. The other thing that I do with this, like I said, I do a lot of slip bobbering with this, and you guys will really see a lot of this rod come like late May and probably through a lot of June. Like I said, same thing, just like when you're Lindy rigging, it's very important to have a longer, lighter action rod, number 1. It's because you can throw a slip bobber a long ways, and if you're trying to throw a slip bobber on a very stiff rod, what's going to happen is you're going to throw the bait off a lot. It's not going to load that tip. So with a very minimal amount of effort, you can throw something very light like this hair jig a very, very long ways, right? So it's awesome for doing that. And just like the Lindy rigging, like I said, when you're slip bobber fishing, you can imagine you cast a bobber out and it goes down, and you'll feel the weight of that bobber on there. But a lot of times you have an angling line. So that line comes from the tip of your rod, it hits that bobber, which is a couple feet underwater, and then it goes down to the fish. What you need to do when you set the hook on a slip bobber is reel that angle out of the line, right? So normally there's a lot of reeling. That rod tip starts to load up. That fish cannot detect that because it's a real light tip. And then you swing into them, and then you get 7.5 feet of rod to kind of swing into those fish and catch up to them. So Like I said, this is the 7.5 foot medium light. You know, if you guys are trying to pick up more of a live bait rigging or slip bobber style rod, or another great thing to do with this is, like I said, throw hair jigs, because it can throw very small hair jigs like this 3/32 an absolute mile. So it's an absolute killer for that too. And if you're going to get just a specifically hair jig designed rod, I'd probably go something like a slightly little bit lighter, like a 7.6 light or a 7.9 light. But this medium light 7.5 foot rod is a great all around kind of do everything finessey live bait rigging style rod. So absolutely one of my favorites here. You guys probably haven't seen a lot of this rod yet unless we're hair jigging, and then we have been using it a lot. But as the season goes on, you're going to see a lot of this, whether it's fall lindy rigging with chubs, whether it's summer lindy rigging with crawlers and leeches, whether it's slip bobber fishing with leeches or crawlers. Great rod to add to your arsenal right there, especially if you're a guy who just has like a lot of 6.6 mediums, right? This is kind of a great rod to kind of fit that other end of the spectrum right here. And like all my rods, paired with the Piscifun Carbon X 2000 on there. I like to put 10-pound or 8-pound braid on this rod most of the time, and then light fluorocarbon leader depending on what you're fishing with. So that's kind of the deal right there. Another great thing to remember with fishing a lighter action, medium light, or light action rod for a lot of your live bait applications, like your rigging stuff, is you can go down to much lighter line. If you start getting into like a medium, a straight medium, and you really start pinning fish on the hook set, that puts a lot of pressure on 6-pound. Where this thing, you could probably go down to like a 4-pound or a 6-pound, and with how much this rod loads and how deep it loads into the rod, you can get away with fishing a very light line. So that's just another added bonus to fishing these lighter action live bait rods. Right there. Wow, very next cast. All right, well, this brings us into my next favorite rod, which I wish we were using a jig and a minnow on it, because it's my absolute favorite live bait rod for jig fishing. The last rod we used, that 7.6, is my absolute favorite, like lindy rigging, live bait rigging rod. This is my favorite finesse jig fishing rod, and this rod is there's a little tiny smallmouth right there, not important, but this rod is the 7'3" medium light, and this is my absolute favorite live bait jig rod for really anything under like half an ounce. And there's a couple things that I don't think a lot of people probably think about when they're fishing a jig rod. Number one, you want a relatively fast rod with a little bit of tip play. And you can see the difference between this rod and the last rod. Like I said, this one has a little bit of tip load because it's a medium light, but then it transfers into a lot of backbone. Why do you want a medium light rod when you're jig fishing? Well, the number one reason is, like, let's say we cast a jig, 1/8 ounce jig and a minnow out there, right? And we pick up and there's our fish on there. We don't want a rod so stiff that when we pick up, it pushes that fish off, right? Or that fish can really detect that. You want a little bit of tip load, so that fish picks it up, that tip just flexes a little bit, and you're like, okay, there's a fish on there. Another reason I really like using a medium light rod for doing this is that, no wait, we got weeds here, just weeds. But is so that I can cast a light jig a long ways, like you know, a 1/4 ounce or 1/8 ounce or 3/16, depending on what you're jigging with, without that minnow just flying off, right? There's nothing worse than trying to chuck a minnow a really long ways and having it fly off on every cast. This rod you guys have probably seen me use more, and is one of my favorite all around use for everything type of things, right? I'm not throwing like huge rip and wraps on this. I'm not throwing super big jigs, but it's a great rod for throwing like this here. 1/8 ounce jig and a swim bait, right? Great rod for doing something like that. As far as a finesse application rod for a lot of your jigging techniques, whether that's smaller blade baits, jigging a minnow fishing, light jigs and plastics, and just kind of pulling them along, this is my absolute go-to. And it's probably the rod that I fish with more than anything. So if you guys are kind of looking to pick up a a new jig rod this year. Definitely give the 7.3 a go, this medium light. And it's a little bit longer than probably a lot of guys' jig rods, which the more the older I get, the more I appreciate longer rods with softer tips, right? And I think the reason is I fight fish relatively hard, and when you're fighting fish too hard on a very stiff rod, there's not enough room there to load. If you're gonna fight fish hard, you really want a rod that loads up a lot, right? And I don't know if I just tend to fight fish very hard, or I've just, you know, seen how good this is at keeping fish on, right? And a lot of times if you're just pulling way too hard on a rod that's too stiff, you lose a lot of fish. This 7.3 just has an absolutely gorgeous parabolic curve to it, and is one of my absolute favorites. If you're gonna try to get one of these, I would I know you can like submit an order and you'll like get it put on a list, because they are very backed up, like everybody in the fishing industry right now. But the 7.3 is an absolute go-to for a lot of my live bait presentations. And if you're looking to get a rod like this, you know, I would say, you know, try to stay right around that 7 foot, whether that's 7'10" or 6'9", 6'10", kind of up to that 7'3" foot range. What's the difference between this and the 7.6? The 7.6 is much looser up in the tip, right? Both very sensitive rods, both have nice loose tips, but the 7.3 is definitely a little bit stiffer than that 7.6. So that's the reason I like that rod for doing this. Like I said, today I just threw a swim bait on it, made one cast and caught a fish on it. And same thing, that's a Piscifun Carbon X 2000 on there. 10-pound braid, pretty much do it for all your jigging techniques, and then I just tie on a little fluorocarbon leader. So 7.3, if you're looking to get a rod for that live bait fishing, live bait presentation stuff, or just a lot of kind of your light application stuff, you know, for like a lot of your, like I said, smaller blade baits. Love this rod for smaller blade baits. If you're throwing a really stiff rod and smaller blade baits, a lot of times you're going to pull those smaller hooks out of fish, where a lighter tip on something like this keeps that bait from getting pulled too hard out of that fish, right? And any kind of presentation where you might cast it out, the bait might be on the bottom, you'll pull up and there might be a fish on, great for something like that, right? Because like I said, you can detect that fish before they detect you. So you'll kind of pull up, you'll feel that fish just kind of sitting on it like that, and then boom, set the hook and you got them. So you guys have seen me catch a million fish on this rod. Hopefully we threw some good footage in throughout the way. And yeah, that's kind of why I like the 7.3 medium light a lot. All right, so for the third and final rod, which never leaves my boat all season long, is the 6'9" medium fast. This is the Elliott 6'9" medium fast. Now, where does this fit? This is the power fishing rod. This is your power snap jigging rod. This is your rip and wrap rod. This is your big blade bait rod. This is your heavy jigs and heavy current kind of a rod for me. And I got a little bass blade bait on here right now, but the big difference in this rod is much less tip play, right? A little bit shorter, really nice for snap jigging, doing stuff like that. And main thing with snap jigging is, like, if I take my rod and do this, I do not want that tip doing this, is what you get out of a lot of rods that are much lighter. If you're taking that jig and really cracking it like that, and that tip's going like that, it makes it very hard to feel that bite that follows, right? And this rod is the one I use in Green Bay pretty much exclusively when I'm throwing rip and wraps, or a lot of these 3/8 ounce blade baits, things like that. It's also, like I said, my killer snap jig rod. And the reason you want a stiffer rod for doing that, and a much stiffer tip in a rod, is for when you start doing stuff, like I said, that heavy crack, or these real light ones like this. You want to be able to manipulate that bait. I got weeds here. You want to be able to manipulate that bait without doing a whole lot, right? That's why you want that really stout tip on it, right? You don't want it to be so heavy that when you set the hook, it's hardly bending, obviously, because then you lose a lot of fish. This rod is designed just perfectly for doing this technique. You can see it still has a lot of load in it, which is awesome for fighting fish, but it's got that tip on there that is much stiffer than the other two rods and very sensitive, right? And when you start doing a presentation, like I always snap jig really short, either swim baits or jerk minnow juniors, a technique where you're doing the rod like this, you don't want to have to move that rod more than, you know, if you have a light action rod, for example, you're gonna have to move the rod like this to get that bait to have that quick little hop step, right? Where this thing is just this quick, real quick pop, and I know that bait's doing exactly what my rod is doing, right? And same thing for, you know, if you're fishing like a big heavy rip and wrap, right? Or something like a like I said, the other thing we'll do is we'll put mono on this rod, and we'll use it for a jigging wrap, hyper rattles type stuff, your shiver minnows, things like that. But for rip and wraps, kind of same thing. You know, if you have a slower action rod, what you don't want is to end up way up here and have a huge bow in that rod, right? to pull a heavy bait along like that. You want that bait to be very responsive to what the rod does, and you get that by having a much faster tip like this. And this is the 6'9" medium fast. A good rod, you know, I'd be looking for something between 6'9" and 7 foot for something like this. Something you could throw those big baits a long ways, and like I said, really manipulate the bait with the tip of that rod. The other thing is when I'm snap jigging, and let's say I'm doing a lot of this kind of cracking presentation, one thing I really like is that if I hit a fish like this, I know right away in that tip, because it's a little bit stiffer, just right down to your hand immediately, and then it's just boom, right into hook set. So a lot of times when you're cracking a bait, you got enough power in just popping that bait along with braid, where a stiffer tip on a rod like this, you can actually hook the fish doing that. So that's another nice feature as well. But again, super light rod. It is super ultra sensitive and is kind of my perfect all-around snap jig rod. I also like it for smallmouth fishing. It's one of my favorite tube rods, because a lot of times when you're fishing tubes, you're kind of doing a similar thing, right? You don't want a rod that's all long and spongy when you have a 1/2 ounce tube on, or a 3/8 ounce tube on. You want a rod that you can manipulate that bait a lot with, right? And you do that, if you're doing something like this with a tube, that tip's not really loading a whole lot. That tube's just kind of bouncing through the rocks just like that, right? And that's exactly what you want in a rod like this. So has a bunch of different applications, whether you're fishing, like I said, big swim baits, big rip-in wraps, big blade baits, snap jigging some 1/4 ounce plastics. This is my power fishing rod. And most of the time I'm fishing this, I'm bombing out long casts, and I'm fishing very fast and covering a lot of water with some kind of bait, right? Like I said, whether that's a blade bait, a big plastic, or a rattle bait like a rip and wrap. So those are kind of my 3 rods, and they all kind of have multiple purposes, but they each do something that the other doesn't, right? And your 7.6, that's kind of your live bait rigging rod. 7.3 is my jig and minnow stuff most of the time, or my finesse jig type of rod. And then this 6'9" medium fast, this is my power fishing rod. So if you're looking to get some new rods this year, you can definitely check out the Elliott stuff. I'll throw some links down below. Be patient no matter who you're buying fishing gear from this year. It's difficult to get stuff, and you guys are buying all of it too. And you guys aren't alone. I'm buying it as well, but that's kind of my 3 rod walleye setup right there, and you guys will see a lot of these throughout the season. So if you're in the market for something, hopefully this answered a lot of questions for you guys. If you're looking to pick up a new rod, hopefully this was helpful and just showing you some things to look for in a rod that might fit what you're looking for. And ultimately, yes, you do catch more fish when you're using the right rod, line, and reel for the right situation. That's just kind of how it is. But I appreciate you guys watching. Me and Surly are going to go in, get out of the cold. We have more chores to do around the house today, Surly, and we'll see you guys next time. Stay tuned. Like I said, we're going to be getting out of northern Wisconsin, going south to somewhere we could fish some walleyes, and we'll see you on the road. Thanks for watching.